why not add a little juice to the to the show? You are watching Margaritas with Margarita Chang, CFP Pro, where today you will meet Bree Williams, head of practice management at State Street Global Advisors. She's outside of Boston. Rita is in DC. I'm in Santa Fe. I'm Hope Heskett, producer of the show. Today's topic is mental models, anchoring effect, and how it impacts your financial decision making. Fantastic. Take it away, Miss Rita.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Hope. And Bree, thank you so much for being here. I just want viewers and listeners to know that we met through Women in ETFs. So thank you for your passion and leadership for helping women thrive in the ETF industry and all you do.
Thank you, Rita. And it's a pleasure to be with like minded individuals. So I thank you for everything you've done to help enable path forward and everyone plays a trail that's unique to their own.
So let's get to it. The anchoring effect and how it affects your financial decision making. This is such an appropriate topic because every time you turn around, the one thing that is certain is volatility. So, why is it important to understand investors' biases?
So I think it's important both for the professional and for the individual to take the time to understand how cognitive bias, which is also another way of saying the mental processing shortcuts in our brain, can impact the way we approach making a choice. And even if it's a tough realization to face, when we all make decisions, regardless of the hat that we wear in our professional and personal lives, we have to recognize that we're actually a lot less rational than we really think we are. So having an open mind and an objective posture, to approaching this topic is really step one. And we're constantly under the influence of our own cognitive biases. And what that really means is it just places a distortion, can influence our beliefs, it can sway some of our judgments and choices on things that we make each and every day. So this is something constant. It's not specific to financial decision making, but for today's conversation, something we focus on specifically. And I think we have to recognize, well, why does this happen? And it's because we have a limited attention span. So we think about our resources; they're just limited when it comes to our attention. And that what that means is we just simply can't evaluate every possible detail and event forming thoughts and opinions. So we use those mental shortcuts as a way to speed things along. And that's not a good or a bad thing, but it's something for us to be more mindful of. And we rely on those shortcuts just to get things through more expeditiously. And that can sometimes to the bias creation that we're talking about. We just cannot take the time to really step back on every thought, every decision to look for any presence of bias. But if we learn about what we might be holding as a bias or might default to, such as anchoring, as an example, and work on developing this greater self awareness and that understanding, then we're going to be in a better position over time to learn how to course correct for ourselves. And if you're looking at this through the lens of a financial professional, help coach your individual investors, your clients, to better decision making for what they're looking to achieve, which is simply staying on track with their financial plan and achieving financial wellness. This takes commitment, of course, by both you as the coach, if you're the financial provider, and the individual and couples and families that you're serving. It's not as easy as just flipping on and off a switch. We need to work on this, and we all have the capacity to improve our own self awareness and efficiency when we think about how we approach decision making.
Thank you for that, Bree. And I mean, I think about that because my undergraduate degree, I have two, finance and East Asian language and literature. I think that I personally could have benefited from taking more classes in psychology because CFP, I'm proud that I have the designation, but sometimes you do have to help people level set. So if you can talk about anchoring biases and how we level set, that would be really helpful for everyone.
And I couldn't agree more. I wish I also took some more psych classes. It's not only fascinating, but really important to how we help individuals achieve more than they thought possible. So when we think about one's attitude or their mindset, how that might influence behavior, you know, they're not always perfectly aligned. And attitudes can be enduring, but they can also change over time. And I think that's the key takeaway we should all walk away from today's conversation, because that means you have the power. And if you are the coach in this case, you have a very influential power to help someone improve their decision capability. The key is to stay really focused on what is your purpose and how can you strike a balance between the intersection of what really matters and what can we actually control. So what we're really thinking about, what's our view on the world? What's our life orientation? That really boils down to two schools of thoughts, optimism and pessimism. And all of us are going to fall somewhere on that spectrum because it's a fundamental human trait relative of our own cognitive biases. And most of us tend to fall somewhere in the middle. But you know, again, regardless of where you are, you don't want it to be thought of as good or bad thing. It's just part of our life orientation. And we have the ability to think about how we can improve that. You asked particularly about Rita, the anchoring bias. So I think it's helpful, like, what is that? So anchoring bias is a processing shortcut cognitively, and it's also one of the most difficult ones to mediate. So if you think about it in very simple terms, what's the anchor? Well, that's the initial piece of information that can influence your decision or perception. And where does that bias come into play? Well, that happens when we fail to appropriately adjust for new information because we're anchored to whatever that original reference point is. So, as an example, in the financial realm, if we think about investors, they often will use their stock purchase price as a deciding factor. Do I hold that? Do I sell that? Do I buy more shares? Even after they might learn some conflicting information about the company's future prospects. So, how they're evaluating that stock potential becomes anchored in what did I pay for it?
No, absolutely. I mean, anchoring bias is so important to understand because if you're not aware of it, it is really hard to have the clients take a meaningful action to reach their goals. So I know you talked a lot about financial wellness. There's also financial confidence, but I love this term, financial resilience. So I know your team at State Street Global Advisors has really been focusing on resilience. And I think it's really nuanced, but very important resilience versus optimistic or optimism when it comes to investor behavior.
Absolutely. And I'm going to just admit right here, I think resilience is such a motivating concept. And the reason I say that is when you look at what the definition is, let's use the American Psychology Association's definition. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. So when we think about finances and the current environment involving the last 2.5 years, global health pandemic, volatility, I would say that's some significant source of stress. So when you have the ability to strengthen your resilience, which we all do because you're not born with it, it's not a trait, you have the ability to strengthen that over time and work on it, then you can pull through really difficult times and achieve personal growth. So you mentioned the financial wellness. So when you tap into and build your resilience as an investor, it's really instrumental in how you can stay focused on what your true purpose is for investing and minimize or try and avoid altogether, which we know we can't take off the map completely, but dial down some of the counterproductive behaviors. So when you think about, is someone who's more resilient, are they more positive and optimistic than someone who's less resilient? You know, I think what you'll find from academic observations is that individuals who are more resilient, they're simply better able to regulate their emotions. And that's the benefit of working on becoming more resilient. They're just in a better position because they've strengthened their resilience to maintain that level of optimism through what can be often a very trying circumstance.
So, what can we do? I know your team's been working on this a lot. I mean, this is 24/7, it's constant because there is so much noise. What can we do to help investors improve their financial resilience or gain greater self awareness of these biases?
Sure. I mean, there's so many things you can do, but when it comes to making choices in your financial life, you have to learn to spot these biases. And that comes back to our own framing lens. We tend to look at things with a rosier outlook, a more optimistic outlook, if you will. Or are we a little more somber and have some of that negative framing or pessimistic attitude? Doesn't mean you're always a Debbie Downer, by the way. Because having some level of skepticism can be healthy. And knowing that these attitudes are not static, but rather fluid, then you have the ability to think about the different factors that are affecting one's positivity. What I think is an interesting real life measure or assessment to kind of take this out of the world of theory is going back to the environment that we're all in today. It is a very strong example of how financial strategy can get lost in all of this noise. And when you look to a secondary index like the Index of Consumer Sentiment, which is developed out of the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center, that index, if you're not familiar with it, is designed to measure the confidence and optimism of consumers in their future financial well-being, as well as the economic conditions. So when I look at, well, what's it telling us in February at this time, about short and long-term expectations of both business conditions and perception of their well-being, where do we stand? Unfortunately, overall in the US, the sentiment remains at very subdued levels. In fact, the early February report that came out actually shows us a decade low when we look at high personal finance and how that's deteriorated in terms of one's outlook. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of intensifying inflation concerns, and then we continue to have bouts of volatility that are weighing down that sentiment. So clearly testing investors' resilience as well as the risk directive. So to help yourself, as an individual investor and as a coach, I would think about maybe two different strategies. So the first one, is how do I outsmart this anchoring bias? And it's first, you got to acknowledge it. So be aware of your mindset. Where do you tend to sit within that spectrum of optimism and pessimism, or your life orientation, how you view the world? And knowing that life orientation, naturally, where you sit today, you're in a better spot to then look at, where am I? What do I need to work on to strengthen? So you can better anticipate that prejudice judgment. So going back to our example about the stock price, if you already know you're going to be anchored on what you paid for it 5 years ago before you choose to make a choice on that buy, sell, or hold, that is something you can ground yourself now in a more meaningful focal point. Why are you looking at potentially buying, selling, or holding more of this particular investment? In line with, where are you in your financial plan? Where do you need to go? And then working with your financial provider, or if you're working with that client, what is that investment purpose? What can we control? And what are the factors that are important? Can help you then have a little bit more clarity in how you make that choice. The second tactic is about, if you can, and usually we can when it's about our financial decision making, delay your decision. Take the time to get the information that you need and slow down the decision making process. Unless something is truly time sensitive, you likely have a moment to step back, take a deep breath, make sure you have what you need to know, and expand that mindset to give you the input and other factors that are a part of the decision making framework, as opposed to just holding on to that particular anchor, what I paid for that particular stock price. Again, back to my example. And the goal in that delaying it, even if it's just a couple hours, a day, or a week, depending on your time frame pressures, then you're in a better position to focus and pick what is my most suitable option, which will help you walk further away from that initial shortcut just to speed things along when you don't necessarily have to.
I love that because it's no longer impulsive. Like you're really taking the time to evaluate. And as far as stock price is concerned, I know what has been helpful for me and working with the clients is looking at that number for their financial plan and then also setting limit orders. So if I forget or they forget or they change their mind, uh, if their stock goes up, guess what? They still have those shares of stock. But if they go down, we are relieved that we took some money off the table. Well, thank you so much, Brie. I do have a question. All this has been so helpful. Is there like a resource website that you can reference so we can read more about the amazing work you and your team are doing with practice management?
Absolutely. And on this topic in particular, especially if you're more curious about your own life orientation and where you fall on that spectrum, I would be happy to arm you and your listeners with a life orientation test. Now, to be clear, it's a short version. So this is not like this massive time commitment on your part if you wanted to explore this. Think about it as like those magazine and online quizzes where there's a handful of questions, you're going to get immediate answers to see where you stand. But this shorter version is based on the actual psychology self-help instrument tool, and that gives us an understanding of, what's the level of optimism in that particular individual. And the scoring information that you're going to get back just gives you an understanding of where you stand in your outlook and give you a place to start to build on that self-awareness and improve your own financial decision making journey. It's not just sitting on our website, Rita, so I'll be happy to just provide you with a PDF, and perhaps you can post that on your own resource site, and let people take their shot and see where they stand. And remember, wherever you fall, it's not a good or a bad thing, it's just the status of your current life view.
Well, awesome. We will definitely include that in the liner notes. Thank you so much for being here to help us be aware of our biases and just know what steps we can take to move forward. So now back to you, Hope.
Thank you so much. Awareness, right? That's the whole game, isn't it? Thank you, Bree. That's amazing. And thank you, Miss Rita. So Friday nights, 5 p.m. Eastern time is when you can watch Margaritas with Marguerita Chang, where we bring on amazing gifts like Bree. Next Friday, you will be talking with Barclay Sisk, the Vice President of First Atlantic Brokerage. Tell us a little bit about him.
So, Barkley actually reached out to me because I wrote an article about long term care premiums and what to do about these increases. He is actually going to be talking about how to handle them and how to plan for long term care event in light of um, higher inflation, higher healthcare costs, and stock market volatility. So, we're continuing the theme.
And so present, right? So what where we are right now, everything is shifting, changing, and Margaritas with Marguerita Chang brings us into the light of what is going on right now and how you can best calmly, open heart, deal with it. So thank you, Rita. Thank you, Bree, and thank you to our audience here live on Facebook and watching this on margaritachang.tv. We'll talk to you all next Friday. We'll see you soon. Stay well.